The morning sunlight slanted through the blinds of my small farmhouse in Cedar Creek, Texas, painting golden stripes across the worn wooden floor. I, Walter Thorne, a man of 67, had spent decades watching this land and its slow seasons. Retirement, I thought, would bring quiet afternoons and long drives along the winding roads of this county, with nothing more demanding than the thermostat or my garden. But today, something had changed, though I didn't realize it fully yet. Clara, the woman who had been helping with the house for nearly 20 years, moved with a grace that belied her years. She had always been there, washing dishes while humming old country tunes, folding laundry while chatting softly about her grandchildren. She was a fixture, like the oak tree in the front yard or the slow creek that cut through the property. I never thought much beyond her kindness, and perhaps, too, the small jokes she'd slip in when I wandered into the kitchen too early in the morning. But that morning, her glance lingered longer than usual. When she handed me the coffee, her fingers brushed mine in a way that sparked a brief, inexplicable shiver. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was just the chill in the air. The same way the winter light slants sharp enough to feel like a touch. "Morning, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice softer than usual, almost uncertain. I cleared my throat, fumbling with the mug, suddenly aware of how warm it felt in my hands. "Morning, Clara," I said, keeping my tone steady, though my mind raced. There was a familiarity in her presence that had always been comforting. And now it was different, dangerous, in a sense I couldn't yet name. Later, when I settled into the porch with my newspaper, the town awakening lazily in the distance, I caught her reflection in the window behind me. She was rearranging the flowers I had planted along the railing. Yet there was a pause in her movement, a hesitation that made my pulse quicken. I told myself I was imagining things, that after 67 years, my mind was simply playing tricks. But then she smiled, not the friendly, neighborly smile I had been accustomed to, but something softer, intimate. As if she were sharing a secret only I could understand. Throughout the morning, I felt a strange awareness of her presence in every room. When I heard the faint scrape of her shoes across the wooden floor, I froze. As if her mere steps could expose a truth I hadn't acknowledged before. Lust. It had been decades since I thought about such a thing. My marriage, my routines, the careful rhythms of my life, all had been built to ignore it. To retire from desire quietly. But there it was, creeping back, unbidden, unexpected, in the form of Clara. By noon, the house was quiet again, save for the hum of the old ceiling fan. I found myself in the kitchen, pretending to check a cabinet but really watching her as she cleaned. Our eyes met briefly over the rim of a glass. And I noticed the way her lips curved subtly, the tiniest shift that spoke volumes. My heart pounded. I wanted to tell myself to stop, to remind myself of my vows. The decades of routine and propriety. But my body remembered what my mind had long tried to suppress, the heat, the thrill. The dangerous allure of someone who could see me in ways I thought forgotten. It was when she bent down to pick up a fallen cloth that I noticed the delicate curve of her neck, the subtle strength of her back. My hand twitched involuntarily, a betrayal of my composure. And then she straightened, our eyes locking, and for a fleeting second, the room disappeared. All the walls, the sunlight, the humming of the ceiling fan, they faded into insignificance. There was only Clara and me, and the unspoken tension stretching like a thin wire between us. I tried to speak, to reclaim control, but my voice faltered. "Clara," I began, and the word sounded foreign in my own mouth. She raised an eyebrow, a small, knowing flicker that made the blood rush to my face. And then she said it, almost as if reading my thoughts. "You've changed, Mr. Thorne. Retirement suits you differently." The sentence was harmless enough on the surface. Yet the undertone, warm, teasing, intimate, pierced through the careful armor I had built over the years. Lust didn't retire with me, I realized. It had only been waiting, patiently, for the right moment. For the right person to awaken it again. By evening, the air cooled, carrying the scent of pine and the faint smoke from my neighbor's fireplace. I sat on the porch, the sun dipping behind the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. Clara passed by, pausing at the gate to wave, her fingers lingering on the post longer than necessary. I felt a tension I hadn't known in years, a dangerous, delicious tension. I knew I was at a crossroads, to deny it, to walk away. To preserve the calm of my long-retired life, or to explore the spark that had been awakened. Quietly but irrevocably, in the heart of my quiet farmhouse. And as the shadows lengthened and the stars blinked awake, I understood something both thrilling and terrifying: desire does not age. It waits, patient and cunning, and sometimes it chooses the most unexpected moment and person to return. The next morning carried a heaviness I hadn't anticipated. The sun rose over Cedar Creek, spilling pale light across the farmhouse, but inside, the air felt charged, electric. Clara was already moving about, her routine meticulous. Yet something had shifted. I could feel it in the way she walked. The soft brush of her sleeve against my arm as she passed. And the way her eyes lingered just a fraction longer than propriety allowed. I told myself to ignore it, that imagination was playing tricks. After all, decades of life in this town had taught me to measure everything, every glance, every word. But the tension between us was no longer subtle. It hummed beneath our interactions, a low, persistent vibration that made my chest tighten. By mid-morning, she was in the kitchen, humming a tune I couldn't place, bending to wipe a counter with deliberate slowness. I leaned against the doorway, pretending to read a newspaper but aware of every movement, every subtle shift in her posture. The sun through the window caught in her hair, turning strands to molten gold. My mind betrayed me, tracing the curve of her neck, the slight arch of her back. And I felt a pulse of desire I hadn't known in years. "You're quiet today," she said, without looking up, her voice soft but pointed. I cleared my throat, just enjoying the morning. Her head tilted slightly, and a faint smile played on her lips. "Is that so?" I wanted to respond with a joke, to deflect, but the words lodged in my throat. There was a subtle electricity in the air. An unspoken question neither of us dared to voice aloud. The house, once a sanctuary of routine, now felt like a stage for some silent, delicate seduction. Later, as I stepped onto the porch to check the mail, I caught her out of the corner of my eye, arranging flowers along the railing. She looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that lingered in your mind long after it faded. I forced myself to look away, to focus on the mundane task of opening the mailbox. But even as I held the letters in my hand, my thoughts returned to her. The day stretched on, each hour dripping with quiet tension. When I returned to the kitchen for a glass of water, she met my gaze over the sink. And we held that look for a moment longer than usual. It was a simple, silent acknowledgement of the strange dynamic between us. Desire, I realized, was no respecter of age or circumstance. It had returned, stealthy and insistent. And it was coming for me with the subtlety of a whisper in an empty room. That evening, I found myself unable to settle. The sunset bled through the sky in vivid purples and oranges, and Clara lingered near the gate. Her figure silhouetted against the dying light. I wanted to call out to her, to bridge the space that had always been polite and distant. But I didn't. Instead, I felt the pull of temptation, raw and undeniable. And I knew that the quiet of retirement had been shattered. Lust had found its way back into my life, patient, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. The following days blurred into a fragile rhythm of quiet tension. Every interaction with Clara seemed charged, yet outwardly. We maintained the familiar politeness of years spent together. I found myself watching her from the corner of my eye as she dusted the shelves or tended to the garden, noting how her movements carried a fluidity and subtle intention that went unnoticed before. I told myself it was harmless admiration. A fleeting acknowledgement of beauty in the mundane, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. One afternoon, I found her on the porch swing, humming softly to herself. The warm light caught the strands of her hair, giving them an almost ethereal glow. She looked up as I approached, her smile easy, yet there was an undertone in it, a private, shared joke between us, though we had not spoken a word of it. I never realized the swing could be so comfortable, she said lightly, patting the seat beside her. I hesitated, aware that an invitation lingered in the air. Though she might not have intended it. Part of me wanted to sit, to share a quiet moment that was just ours. Yet another part, the part that had spent decades clinging to routine and decency, warned me to retreat. Still, I found myself sliding onto the swing. Close enough that our shoulders almost touched. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of unspoken thoughts and suppressed yearning. We watched the sunlight play across the yard. The shadows of the oak tree stretching long and thin. I felt her presence like a current beneath the surface of a calm lake, subtle but undeniable. You've changed since retirement, she said, her voice softer now, almost intimate. I swallowed, unsure how to respond. I suppose life has a way of changing us, whether we're ready or not. Her laugh was low, teasing, and I felt a flicker of heat I had thought long extinguished. There was a daring in her gaze that made me acutely aware of my own heartbeat. The rapid thrum that contradicted my outward calm. That evening, after dinner, I found her in the kitchen again. Washing dishes with a methodical patience that always fascinated me. The faint scent of lemon soap mixed with her perfume hung in the air. And I realized I was holding my breath, watching her. Caught between desire and the lingering guilt of age, propriety, and decades of a settled life. Mr. Thorne? She asked suddenly, breaking the spell. I looked up, startled. Her eyes held a glint, playful and knowing. Are you going to tell me what you're thinking, or just keep staring all day? I laughed nervously, attempting to diffuse the moment. Just appreciating the quiet company. Her gaze softened, yet the intensity remained. A silent pull that drew me in ways I could no longer deny. I realized then that the boundary between employer and employee, between decency and desire, was thinning, imperceptibly, dangerously. Lust, subtle and insistent, was no longer a secret, it had begun to stake its claim. Later, I wandered the house in restless pacing, my mind a tangle of longing, fear, and disbelief. I thought of my wife, my decades of routine, the carefully maintained decorum that had defined my existence. And yet, Clara's presence, her gaze, her touch, even the smallest accidental brush of fingers, had awakened something fierce and undeniable. By nightfall, when the sky was dark and the house quiet, I caught myself imagining her closer. Imagining the warmth of a hand where it shouldn't be, imagining words we had yet to speak. I knew I was standing at the edge of a precipice. One step forward could change everything. Desire didn't care about age, propriety, or reputation. It demanded recognition, attention, and, if allowed, indulgence. And I, Walter Thorne, found that despite 67 years of measured life, I was utterly unprepared for the reckoning that Clara had silently set in motion. That evening, the house felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were aware of the tension that had quietly taken root. I wandered through the dimly lit rooms, pretending to check on things. Yet each step brought me closer to Clara's presence. She moved through the kitchen with her usual grace, the soft swish of her skirt against the floor punctuating the otherwise silent house. Every glance in my direction felt like a spark landing on dry kindling. "I saved some of the pie for you," she said lightly, placing a plate on the counter. Her eyes met mine briefly, and the faintest hint of mischief danced there. I swallowed, feeling my pulse betray the calm facade I was trying so hard to maintain. "Thank you," I murmured, my voice rougher than intended. She hummed softly, and I noticed her hand lingering on the edge of the counter, as though she too sensed the growing charge between us. I wanted to step closer, to say something daring, but the weight of decades of propriety kept my feet rooted to the floor. Still, the tension was undeniable. Later, I found myself in the living room, reading a book I wasn't really absorbing. Clara's presence hovered at the edges of my awareness. She came in to collect the dishes, moving with that same deliberate, mesmerizing rhythm. Her fingers brushed mine as she handed me the plate, and I felt a jolt shoot through me. "You've been quiet all day," she said, her voice soft, teasing. "I suppose I'm just enjoying the evening," I replied, though my mind was racing, imagining things I never thought I would at my age. Her eyes lingered on mine a moment longer, and I felt the undeniable pull of desire. Sharp and insistent. In that quiet house, among the shadows of familiar furniture and the soft glow of lamplight, I realized that what I had long considered dormant within me was very much alive. Lust didn't retire with me, it had simply been waiting, patient and cunning, for the right moment to return. The night stretched on, heavy with unspoken thoughts. I lay awake in my bedroom, listening to the faint creak of the floorboards as Clara moved about, imagining the warmth of her presence closer, imagining words we had not yet dared to speak. Every sound, every shift of her weight, sent ripples through me, reminding me that the boundaries I had once believed unbreakable were now tenuous at best. By the time sleep came, it was uneasy, full of dreams where I reached for her hand and felt the thrill of forbidden contact. When I woke, the morning light promised another day where nothing in my quiet retirement would be the same. Desire had returned, insistent, patient, and unrelenting, and I had no intention of pretending it wasn't there. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and the distant hum of farm machinery from the neighboring property. I stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, and found Clara already tending to the flowers along the railing. She looked up, catching my gaze, and for a fleeting second, the world seemed to shrink around us. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," she said, her tone warm but layered with something unspoken. "Morning, Clara," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. I lingered on the porch, watching her work, noticing the subtle way the sunlight highlighted the curve of her neck and the gentle sway of Her movements, my heart, stubborn as it was, refused to settle into the calm rhythm of retirement. Later, I found her inside the kitchen, stacking dishes with methodical care. When our hands brushed over a plate, the contact lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. A jolt of warmth surged through me. A reminder that decades of careful restraint were no match for the quiet power of her presence. "You seem distracted this morning," she remarked, glancing at me with an expression that mingled amusement and curiosity. "I suppose I have a lot on my mind," I replied, trying to mask the truth that all my thoughts were inexplicably focused on her. Throughout the day, small gestures and glances became messages neither of us dared to voice aloud. She would pass near me, offering a fleeting brush of her shoulder or a brief, loaded smile. I felt a tension coil in my chest, one that had nothing to do with age or propriety, and everything to do with the undeniable pull she exerted over me. By late afternoon, the light slanted through the windows in golden angles, and I found myself drawn to the porch swing. Clara joined me quietly, her presence beside me electric, a shared silence stretching between us. We spoke little, letting the world fade around the edges. Aware of the intimacy in the simplest acts, the swing's creak under our weight, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, the warmth radiating from her hand when our fingers brushed. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet, and I realized how perilously close we were to crossing boundaries that had once seemed inviolable. Desire, patient and insistent, had returned to claim its place, refusing to be ignored, and in that suspended moment, I understood that my quiet retirement was no longer mine to command. Clara had awakened something I had long tried to bury, and the consequences, terrifying and exhilarating, were only beginning to take shape. That night, I lay awake, haunted by her glances, her touches, and the persistent knowledge that what had begun as subtle awareness was evolving into something far more potent. The house, once a sanctuary of routine and calm, now pulsed with the quiet electricity of forbidden longing. And I had no illusions about the storm that was approaching. The next morning, the air carried a faint chill, and the farmhouse felt both familiar and strangely electric. Clara moved about the kitchen with her usual efficiency, yet every motion seemed deliberate, charged with a subtle intensity I could not ignore. When she handed me my coffee, our fingers brushed again. Just briefly, but it was enough to send a shiver through me. "I brought some fresh biscuits," she said softly, placing a small plate on the table. Her eyes met mine, and in them lingered a spark that made my pulse race. I forced a smile, trying to appear composed, but my mind was restless, caught between propriety and an undeniable, growing desire. After breakfast, we both retreated to our usual routines. Yet the quiet between us was heavy with unspoken tension. I found myself wandering through the house, listening to the subtle sounds of her movements. The scrape of her shoes on the floor, the faint hum of her song as she dusted the shelves. Each sound a reminder of the magnetic presence she exerted. By mid-afternoon, I caught her in the garden, tending to the roses I had planted decades ago. She looked up, meeting my gaze, and smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of her lips that made my chest tighten. I wanted to speak, to reach out, to bridge the unspoken distance between us, but I hesitated. The weight of years, of marriage, of societal expectations pressed heavily on me. Yet the more I tried to maintain control, the more insistent the desire became. Every glance, every accidental touch, Every shared silence seemed to pull us closer to a boundary we both knew existed but neither dared to cross. As evening approached, the sky turned a deep violet, and the farmhouse grew quiet except for the creaking of the porch swing. Clara joined me there, the air between us thick with anticipation. We spoke little, letting the rhythm of the swing and the fading light carry a silent dialogue, far more intimate than words could convey. When she finally rose to leave, our hands brushed once more, briefly, fleetingly, but the charge lingered long after she was gone. I stood there, heart pounding, acutely aware that the quiet life I had envisioned in retirement was dissolving into something far more complicated, far more dangerous, and far more exhilarating. Lust, patient and unrelenting, had fully returned, and I could no longer pretend it was anything but real. The night was restless. I lay in bed, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in my memory, imagining moments that had not yet occurred, knowing with an uneasy thrill that my days of calm, measured retirement were irrevocably over. The spark Clara had ignited would not be easily extinguished, and I was powerless to resist its pull. The morning sun spilled gold across the farmhouse, yet there was no comfort in the familiar light. I moved through the rooms with a restless energy, aware of Clara's presence in every corner. She was in the kitchen, humming softly, her movements fluid and deliberate, each gesture carrying an unspoken meaning that pressed against the boundaries I had long maintained. "Good morning, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice carrying warmth and a subtle undertone that made my pulse quicken. "Morning, Clara," I replied, my tone steadier than I felt. I lingered near the doorway, watching her, noting the delicate curve of her neck, the way her hands moved over the dishes with a grace that seemed almost intimate. I felt a stir in me that decades of routine and decency had never prepared me for. By afternoon, the tension had become almost unbearable. Every glance we exchanged, every incidental brush of hands, was heavy with unspoken desire. I caught her in the garden, adjusting the petals of a rose, sunlight glinting off the strands of her hair. I wanted to step closer, to reach out, yet the weight of propriety, of years lived carefully and quietly, kept me rooted. Later, as the house grew quiet and the sky darkened to bruised purples and blues, we found ourselves on the porch swing together once more. Words were unnecessary. The shared silence, the nearness of our bodies, the subtle warmth of her hand against mine, spoke volumes. I knew that this attraction, this lust, had long been dormant, waiting patiently for the right moment, the right person, to awaken it. When she finally rose to leave, our fingers brushed one last time. The touch lingered in my mind, setting my heart racing and leaving an ache that no evening calm could soothe. I watched her walk down the path, her figure bathed in the last light of dusk, realizing that the quiet, ordered life I had thought retirement would bring was gone. Lust had returned in full force, patient, insistent, and irrevocable. That night, I lay awake, haunted by her presence, imagining future moments we had not dared to speak aloud. The farmhouse, once a sanctuary of routine and familiarity, now pulsed with forbidden longing. Clara had awakened something deep within me, something that neither age, convention, nor years of measured living could suppress. And as sleep eluded me, I understood that my life had irrevocably shifted. The spark she had ignited promised consequences both exhilarating and perilous, and there was no turning back.